Today we're going to talk about 14 misconceptions about domestic violence. Intimate partner abuse is incredibly common but very misunderstood. Greetings, loved ones. Help us get these messages out. Please subscribe to our channel, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and hit the like button and the notification bell. Share these messages with others because you never know, just by doing so you could save a life. Today we talk about the first 6 of 14 misconceptions about domestic violence, and tomorrow we'll cover the remaining 8. After a video surfaced of football player Ray Rice punching out his then fiancée Janae in an elevator, domestic violence has been at the forefront of the national conversation. When the couple married, many asked, why would she stay with him? Twitter answered back with #WhyIStayed and #WhyILeft, in which survivors shared their stories of why they remained in abusive relationships and why they eventually got out. Yet misconceptions persist, that abuse is a private matter, that women who stay with abusive partners are simply weak-willed, that women are just as abusive as men. Cosmopolitan.com talked to the experts to clear up some of the most stubborn and most dangerous myths about intimate partner violence. So let's discuss these. Myth number 1. Domestic violence is unusual. The truth is, 1 in 4 women, 1 in 7 men will experience relationship violence in their lives. From 2003 to 2012, domestic violence accounted for nearly a quarter of all violent victimizations. Many people think domestic violence is uncommon and it hardly ever exists anymore, says Katie Ray Jones, president of the National Domestic Violence Hotline and the National Dating Abuse Hotline. She says even the stats we have are just for physical violence, and it doesn't take into account verbal and emotional abuse. She says, one woman told me, I can still hear his voice in my head even though I've been out of the relationship for 3 years. I feel like I'm still sitting there. Ray Jones says that it really has long-term impacts on the woman, and it takes a really long time to heal from. While still common, incidences of domestic violence along with other crimes have decreased significantly since the mid-90s. There's less of social acceptance of it, women are more economically independent and mobile and therefore better able to lead, and there are more services for survivors, including Ray Jones Hotline, which you can call at 1-800-799-7233 or find online. They also do live chats. You know, that's been good for both women and men. Fewer women are victims than in previous decades, and fewer abusive men are killed by their wives. Now the wives can leave instead of thinking murder is the only way out. Myth number 2. It's impossible to love someone who abuses you. I work with so many women who have been victims, and women feel so much shame and embarrassment over the fact that they love someone who is abusive to them. They still see a glimpse of the person they fell in love with. It's very complex and it's very hard. They don't want the relationship to end, they just want the violence to end. Myth number 3. Domestic violence happens when someone flies out of control. The TV movie picture of domestic violence is an out-of-control man flying into a fit of rage. But that's not always how it goes. Domestic violence is a pattern of behavior in which one exerts power and control over the other individual, Ray Jones says. To use the phrase, he's out of control isn't accurate. Actually, everything about this person is about control. There are a lot of strategies that an abusive partner uses to control their partners aside from physical violence, like verbal abuse, isolation, controlling the finances, reproductive coercion, sabotaging birth control so a partner gets pregnant, and he's saying she must stay home with the baby. It's usually not a one-time incident. In all the years that I have been doing this, I've never worked with a victim who said it was only one time. Maybe there was one physical abuse incident, but she usually speaks to the isolation, the verbal abuse, the fear, and the threats. Myth number 4, domestic violence is always physical. Intimate partner violence exists on a continuum of behaviors. It's not just punching and slapping, and it's rare that the first act of abuse is a violent one. Abuse can be emotional, psychological, verbal, sexual, and often escalates. An abuser may initially be charismatic and caring before slowly starting to wear away at your self-esteem by criticizing you. implying you simply aren't good enough and isolating you from family and friends. And then it's less shocking and harder to leave when verbal abuse begins or when it turns to physical abuse. Abusers may also push your sexual boundaries by coercing or pressuring, threatening or intimidating you into unwanted sexual activity or even sexually assaulting you. And reproductive coercion, tampering with your birth control, or pressuring you to get pregnant is another common abuse tactic. With 1 in 3 women in relationships with abusers experiencing reproductive abuse. Myth number 5. If someone abuses you, it's the obvious decision to leave the relationship. Conversations about domestic violence always come back to, why does the woman stay? Says Michelle Kaminsky, the lawyer at Brooklyn District Attorney Kenneth Thompson, appointed as the chief of the DA's Office Domestic Violence Bureau. She says, we talk about it as this very simple solution. If someone is abusive to you, you just walk away. But it's a complex situation. If you are economically dependent on someone and you depend on them to pay the bills, if they're paying the mortgage or the rent or putting food on the table, or if you're the one working and you can't afford childcare, that makes it harder to leave. Kaminsky says, we shouldn't be so quick to judge from outside a relationship, and all of us can have blinders on when it comes to love. An abusive partner is not as abusive at every moment of the day, Kaminsky says. There's a tendency in domestic violence to look at the victims as an other. We've all been in relationships that are good, and we've all been in relationships that are bad. And you might have a friend who says, he's a jerk. But he's not a jerk to you all the time. And it's easy to judge why other people stay in a relationship than to understand that human relationships are complex. And for the people in abusive ones, that abuse is not necessarily what defines the relationship. There's also legitimate fear that separating from their partner will lead to more violence, given that women in relationships with abusers are at most risk when they try to leave. Ray Jones says what people don't realize is that when there's domestic violence, the fear is real. We live in an age when there's so much technology and access to media that we're able to hear these stories of the husband who killed his wife and kids. We know in domestic violence relationships there are a lot of threats. I'm going to take the kids. I'm going to hurt you. Women know that isn't an empty threat. Instead of asking why women don't leave, we should make it easier for them to do so. We need to have the resources out there to make it easier for a woman to leave, Kaminsky said. Imagine if the discussion were framed around that, instead of, well, she's a free agent, she can do what she wants. You can question why she's staying, but let's talk about the difficulty of leaving. If you can't afford childcare, who's going to take care of your children? These become real economic issues. Let's talk about universal, affordable, safe childcare. Let's talk about affordable, safe housing. I wish people could put themselves in that situation. If I had to suddenly leave my husband, where am I going to go? Why would you want to go to a shelter or be relocated by all your family and everyone you know and your kids and school is in your old neighborhood? People say she should go here and she could do that. But I wish they would just think, would it be so easy for me to do that? Myth number 6. There's no good reason for a victim not to call the police. Calling the police is a lifesaver for many women, but many hesitate because they don't want their partner to go to jail, or because they fear calling may escalate the violence, or because they don't trust that the police won't themselves act violently, which is a legitimate fear, especially in communities of color and LGBT victims of violence. Police can sometimes be insensitive or even hostile to abuse victims, and making a police report can set into motion a series of events that a victim finds confusing and disempowering, or that lead to more violence. A lot of domestic violence victims think, I know him and I'm the only one who can really navigate that, and if I involved law enforcement, they would never keep me safe. That sense of fear that no one could ever keep them safe is real. As a society, we tend to undermine or minimize what those concerns are. Why not go to the police? They're in the best position to help you. Well, the police aren't living with you 24/7. Other advocates point out that intimate partner violence is part of a larger pattern of violence against marginalized groups, violence against women, people of color, LGBT people, and others, and that the police can perpetuate that violence. Take the case of Tiwanda Moore, for example. Moore, a young black woman, was living with her boyfriend in an abusive and tumultuous relationship in which the police were often called. On one of those occasions, he called the police trying to get her thrown out of the house. When the police came and the one officer interviewed Moore alone, she says he fondled her and gave her his personal phone number. When she later went to the station to try to file a complaint with Internal Affairs, she was rebuffed and given the runaround. She decided to record the officers with her BlackBerry to show they weren't doing their jobs. For that, she now faces felony eavesdropping charges that could send her to prison for 15 years. This is a prime example of how domestic violence is part of a broader systematic culture of violence, says Claudia Garcia Rojas, co-director of the Chicago Task Force on Violence Against Girls and Young Women, which has been bringing Moore's case to public attention. She says, we tend to believe that encouraging domestic violence victims to use the system will relieve them of the abuse, but in fact the system adds to the dynamic of violence that survivors experience. It is for this reason that we need to understand that domestic abuse is not a private but a social issue. Of course, that doesn't mean calling the police is a bad idea. Police are first responders and can save your life. They can also be a connection to necessary resources. More often than not, the police are the first responders, Kaminsky says. If a woman calls the police here in Brooklyn, she says that call puts her in touch with other services at the Family Justice Center. She says we have staff that help with visitation, child support, divorce. We have counselors and economic self-sufficiency staff who connect victims with all kinds of resources, including GED programs, job training programs, resume building, and affordable housing resources. If they don't make the call, though, they live in isolation. Unfortunately, the resources offered by the Brooklyn DA are not universally available, and so a police call yields very different results from city to city and country to country in every community to community. But the one consistent fact is that while calling the police can be extraordinarily helpful for some victims, just call the police isn't a solution to domestic violence. With 1 in 3 women experiencing domestic violence worldwide and 15 million children witnessing that violence every year, the question is not if you'll encounter a victim of violence, but what will you do when you do encounter them? You could be the person who saves a life. You are called. We are all called to be champions for justice. Those who suffer violence, they need to know that those who love them and those who don't even know them will step out and reach out to them to give them the help and the courage they need to leave before it's too late. Help us get these messages out. Subscribe to our channel, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Hit the like button and the notification bell and share these messages with others. If you're a victim of violence, I want you to listen to me. I'm putting these out for you. You need to know, I was there. I know what it's like. I know what's going on in your head. And the lies that you're told and the lies that you believe keep you bound in that. But I want to tell you the truth. You are valued. You are loved. You are intelligent, you are beautiful, and you can do this. God doesn't want you to suffer violence. He wants you to live free from violence in peace and tranquility. There is a way out. It's not your fault, and abuse is not love. If you're a victim of violence, please reach out to somebody today. And if you find yourself in a dangerous situation, call 911 for help. And if you know of a child who is suffering violence, tell the authorities. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the 8 remaining myths and misconceptions about domestic violence. Until then, God bless you.